Excerpt. So I've been wanting to do an episode on this subject for quite some time. For years, actually. Probably like 23 years, because it's such an important subject to me. But I've also felt like it needed further understanding, like I needed further realization to really deliver this message. But I've come to the conclusion that no matter how much learning is done, it will always be a continual process. So I'm here today to share these symbols and my wrestling and understanding with them. And this video is not about molecular assembly or nanotechnology or radiovirology and bacteriophage nanobots or anything else I learned in school or anything else I learned in STEM classes. This is a bit more philosophical even than that. And it's not about Astronis, though of course he is important to consider. This is not about Maimonides, even though in a way I think I might argue that he is one of the key characters to this story. More important, at least, than any one of them. More important than Descartes, even Dante Alighieri. Just as essential, at least, as Voltaire and Immanuel Kant. Something just as large of a shift in our perception as Teilhard de Chardin. And at least as poignant, if not as beautiful, as the divine milieu, and as daunting, if not as disparaging, as Dante's Inferno, is the show called South Park. And for all of you wondering, whoa, what? I'm gonna go there, trust me. So welcome to the Xirtus Metaphysical Guide to South Park. Now, I started wanting to do this show years ago, and I started putting some slides together, mainly just out of holding on to the pictures I enjoyed. A lot of fan art and things like that. But when I left Connecticut and ended up in Minnesota, right underneath a sign that said Stark Road next to the pond, I couldn't help but think that this was some sort of divine plan. Now that might sound like completely insane to some people, but if you're part of the Church of Synchromistic Memetics, it kind of makes more sense than you might believe. I mean, there are certain times in certain places, certain things go down when certain people are able to see them. You dig? And maybe it's just like the perfect timing right now with all the things going on in the world, and I'm not going to mention too many so that this video can stay topical forever. But it does seem that we're kind of living in some sort of Dante's Inferno, and that everything is sort of several degrees away from being the closest thing to hell. And more, the only thing that seems to really be something you can latch onto with a bit of hope that has like truth besides DuckTales is South Park. I mean, Simpsons doesn't do it for me, for obvious reasons, which I'll get into later. But in terms of synchromystics, I think there's pretty well a general rule that the most important shows, of course, besides Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I would say Buffy the Vampire Slayer is required watching for anyone interested in synchromysticistics, Jungian archetypes, and battling their own personal demons. I'd also suggest the supplemental reading, Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Philosophy, a book that is pretty based. I think I got it used from the UCSC school bookstore. This must have been somebody's required reading. There's also a sort of direction that we're going with this sort of lens, right? Like, the idea is to look at things deeper rather than to try to simplify them. Try to see the most sophisticated parts of them. Examine the corners and angles. You know what I mean? An early example of this, of course, is Calvin and Hobbes. Some of you might remember The Kid and the Tiger. Not the new Tiger King, not the new series on Netflix, but there's your synchromystical connection right there. And Calvin and Hobbes is probably based, and as a kid I was pretty convinced that Calvin and Hobbes was based on, of course, John Calvin, who I'll admit I'm not an ultimate fan of, but there you go, and Thomas Hobbes, who even looks pretty to me in this old picture. Thomas Hobbes is a based philosopher. I like his style and I like his hair. But just to be fair, despite being honest, let me read you a quote from John Calvin. You must submit to supreme suffering in order to discover the completion of joy. Thou, Lord, bruisest me. But here's a good quote from a good philosopher. Hell is truth, seen too late. Thomas Hobbes. Anyone who says different are evil, lying time travelers. But ultimately, South Park, it's about every philosopher and all philosophies being played out by them. Only usually the philosophers are starring children. It's genius. And if you notice some of the earlier philosophers I mentioned, you might start to guess which ones they might represent, for the most part, because of course philosophers and philosophies change in South Park. And the reason South Park was so despised, so loathed by so many people so early on, was because South Park, rather than trying to idealize a false behavior of a dilapidated, hollow, decaying civilization of hypocrites, South Park illustrated the gems of truth and earnesty within human nature despite how low humans can behave. Often to the misrepresentation of the audience that they were glorifying some of these behaviors, when clearly they were not. I mean, can anyone in the comments section please feel free to trickle a list of your own points for why South Park did not glorify the hermaphroditic, crack-addicted, prostitute mother of Eric Cartman. In the first episode of South Park that I had seen in 1998, while on a trip to visit Indiana, staying in the house of a man who had invented his own clock and had come to find when he went to patent the clock that he was 300 years too late to the patent office. Weird countrymen in Indiana. Well, I was sitting in their home where, unlike my home, which was surrounded in mountains and unable to pick up on certain television stations, in fact, most any at all, suspicious in a sort of way for being so close to Silicon Valley, yet isolated, as if to say that Santa Cruz had been shut off from the rest of the world on purpose, like some sort of Soviet oblast in California. Well, not to say that everyone was without access to South Park, but when I first saw it, it was not the first episode. It was the episode about the Czechophosaur. And the way the story unfolded to me, for a first-time viewer of South Park in 1998, at about 8 or 9 years old, it was hilarious and surprising, yet a fully rational series of logic, which helped to explain to a child the issues adults were going through in their relationship with us. And Star Wars, a subject which was, at that moment, the first common ground being had between two generations, otherwise ruined for some of the older audiences and less woke by Jar Jar Binks, arguably the best and most misunderstood character in all of Star Wars. But let's save the debate about evil Jar Jar for later. In the South Park episode about the Czechophosaurus, Cartman and his friends discover, in melting ice, a frozen ancient man, in fact, an otherwise extinct hominid, and the kids all love him, and the parents all hate him. And the trouble with the Czechophosaurus is that he's essentially very foolish and reproduces carelessly. Despite the love of the children, the parents can no longer accept Czechophosaurus in their community, and so Czechophosaurus as well as its family are sent off to France as refugees in Europe, where of course Czechophosaur's absurdism is lauded and applauded, and loved by each and every French man and woman alike. And this was my first episode of South Park. Now, to a child of the 90s, this was profound. The illustrations of the relationships between the parents and the children based on their inability to accept each one of their own incomprehension of the situation at hand, at least philosophically, was so true to life, and depicted time and time again in my own dogma. I mean, how many times did we buy Japanese Pokemon cards and then subliminally become reverent to the Emperor of Japan? How many artificial intelligent towels did we make friends with in our youth? How many times has the devil come to our town? Too many. South Park hit the nail right on the head. Over and over again, South Park keeps hitting the nail on the head. It's like some sort of weird hammer nail metronome. But again, that wasn't the first South Park episode. The first South Park episode was already pretty intense. Nearly immediately after watching the first South Park, I began to try to find the episodes. And back then, in 1998, that meant downloading them in shockwave files of 15 seconds apiece. Hundreds of files to get one 24-minute episode. But it was worth it to watch the entire show. And each 15-second clip would take 3 minutes to download. The amount of wait time was unbearable, and yet oh so worth it. Because eventually, I got to watch South Park, the first episode, the pilot of the show. Not the original pilot, mind you. Just the first episode to air on television. In this episode, Cartman gets an anal probe from aliens, and he has nightmares about it, which he tries to shrug off to his friends. Unfortunately, he cannot fully ignore the aliens that are amongst us, nor the giant satellite protruding from his rectum. And as the time goes on, they start to learn how South Park, Colorado is a very special place, where children and cows are abducted, probed in their nightmares, and then left back in their beds. In fact, we learn it's not just the women and children and cows. Many are experiencing this all their lives, from children to adulthood. They just keep it to themselves. Some can't even do that. Though for Cartman, the cognitive dissonance allows him to completely normalize what's happening to him. For the most part, he tells them, sure you guys, whatever. There's like no satellite. There are no aliens. Yet, when asked about rainbows, Eric Cartman says he hates rainbows because rainbows are always crawling up his leg and biting his buttocks, revealing that Eric has some knowledge of these spectral light beings. And by this point, I was fully hooked on South Park. But it wasn't long after I found episode 1 that I started looking for episode 0. For the past several years, there had been circulating around Hollywood a copy of a videotape created by Trey Parker and Matt Stone called The Spirit of Christmas, Jesus versus Santa Claus.
I keep hearing this melody in my ear.
Brad needs a snowman with a jolly happy soul, with a corncob pipe and a button nose and 2 eyes made out of coal. There must have been some magic in that old silk hat they found, for when they placed it on his head... Dude! What? Don't put the magic hat on the snowman. Why? Because if you do, he's gonna come to life. Cool. No, it's not cool. My sister in Minnesota put a hat on a snowman and it tried to kill her. Fuck him. Let's do it anyway. Yeah. There must have been some magic in that old silk hat they found, for when they placed it on his head... Oh my God! Frosty killed Kitty! Dude! I told you not to put that fucking hat on Frosty's fucking head, now didn't I? Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Rocket fucking Scientist. What are we supposed to do now? I don't know what we're supposed to... Wait, I bet he can help us. Who?
Ho, 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 ho. Whoa, whoa, now tell me what happened slowly.
Okay, we're just building a snowman, and all of a sudden, he came to life. I told him, I said, don't put the magic hat on the snowman. And he did it anyway, and then he killed our friend Kitty, and now he's gonna kill everybody.
Did he look kind of like this?
Yeah, kind of like that. Mm-hmm, exactly. You know, I don't think that was the real Santa Claus. Oh, no shit, Sherlock. You know, thanks to you, there's not going to be any Christmas, and there's no one left to help us. Oh, Christ. Jesus.
Jesus, we beseech thee in this time of need.
Okay, fucking Frosty, he fucking killed my friend.
Dude, this is Jesus. You don't say fuck in front of Jesus.
Go, Jesus! Our Savior! That sucked. I'm sure glad that's over with. Yeah, but you know, I learned something today. Yeah, don't put the magic hat on Frosty. No, I learned about the true spirit of Christmas. Really? Yeah, Christmas isn't about Frosty or Santa. You're right. It's about Jesus. No, it's not even about Jesus either. Well, then what's it all about? Prisons. You see? Prisons. Hey, man, let's go home. I know where my parents hide my presents. Cool.
So he waved goodbye, saying, "Don't you cry, I'll be back again someday." Frosty.
At this point, I think I really understood what South Park was about. You see, South Park is the truth. As we live and as we die, as we learn and as we grow, as we become each other and ourselves. Like the sands of time, these are the days of our lives, and we are all being represented, rather than by one or another, by the entire meta of South Park, where the adults act like children and the children act like adults. And act is the operative word, because everyone has a role to play and everyone is playing their role, and the roles are often switched and changed. And like in some sort of Japanese kabuki or no theater, this allows for the resolution of conflict between Geist and Gestalt, shape and spirit. And also South Park reminds us that we are young at heart and should stay that way. And also that we really are not all that different, except for as different as we want to be, as we demand to be in order to be each other, ourselves, illustrated by the friendship of the first four: Stan Marsh, Cal Broflowski, Eric Cartman, and Kenneth McCormick. Beyond the first four, there are the second fellowship, Craig Tucker, Clyde Donovan, and their friends, Tweak Tweak and Token Black. The odd man out of the group, Leopold, Butterscotch, and hell hath no fury like Windy Testaburger, and the world would seem far less sweet without Bebe Stevens. In some ways, this is a far more complicated Enneagram than even GURDJIEFF would have drawn. Yet to a game theorist, it all makes a certain amount of sense. How each action will unfold into each other's. That's the fundamental rule in South Park. There's never and then. There's always therefore. And as each consequence of each action plays itself out, you can see how the consequences affect each character. Rather than grow in height, these characters grow in stature, revealing a voyeur into life, how some strike it rich, how some fools lose all their gold, how some live in utter poverty, and why they got there. South Park toys with love and destiny, or rather, love and destiny toy with the lives of the characters in South Park. And I'm really enthused with the relationship between Eric Cartman and Heidi Turner. Probably one of the most interesting relationships in television history, really. An autistic boy who feels loved by Alexa and finds intimacy a sort of abuse, slowly driving the young woman insane. It's brilliant. But beyond this conflict and resolution, there's trust and honesty, like between Tweak and Craig. And one wrestles with love and loss, and whether it is better to have lost love than to have never loved at all. In the circumstances of Stan and Wendy, a drama based on the creator's own life story, at least his personal romance and tragedy, which led him near suicide, instead putting all of his attention and effort into focusing on his art and completing his first movie. The moral of the story that love and loss leads to learning and a longer life. But around the earliest of first and second season, it became obvious that South Park was not going to do the thing that all the other shows were doing. And I don't think the producers knew that at the time. The agenda of Hollywood was to embarrass and insult the American public, to humiliate them into rationalizing, transforming their entire society through the rhetoric of propaganda learned in universities in order to differentiate themselves from the nonsense on television. This was clearly not Trey Parker and South Park's agenda. And it seemed to surprise Hollywood when instead South Park went after Hollywood, when South Park started to turn its focus away from their own issues to the issues of celebrities and politicians and the propaganda as a whole. It is perhaps with this insult to the powers that be that South Park became the isolated phenomenon that it is, whereas also by contractual obligation it is nearly impossible to stomp out the fire of what has been created. South Park now is too big. And South Park continues to go after the powers that be instead of just insulting you, the audience. And for this reason, South Park is different than almost all other shows. And this break from normalcy seems to stem from Trey Parker's personal life, right? It seems like in his youth, he was so punk rock, he did not want to agree with anybody on anything out of principle. And he obviously pushed that to pretty far extremes when he was young. But as time's gone on and South Park's more and more defined a narrative of possibility for a future, or a present rather, that we could live in, South Park has become less and less about shocking you and more about breaking societal normalcy. For instance, opposing marriage but being for hetero and homosexuality, or rather tolerant of it, because South Park teaches the differences between tolerance and acceptance. One is required and the other is not. Yet the internet did have a serious outbreak of fanime manga pictures of Tweek and Craig. I mean, there's just so many cute pictures of Tweek and Craig that eventually Trey Parker and Matt Stone wrote it into the show. Who knows what exactly is going on in Japan? I don't know why this is happening, but clearly they love Tweek and Craig, and now because of that, well, Trey Parker loved that Tweek and Craig were loved, so now Tweek and Craig love each other. By the way, try saying that 10 times fast. Anyway, Tweek and Craig are the most stable relationship in the whole world, perhaps, and at least in South Park, where everyone else is yelling at each other and falling apart for the most part because of lies and mistrust. Tweek and Craig are actually constantly working on their relationship. There's a committed honesty between them, and I don't think that they're having sex because they're in 3rd grade. I assume they're saving themselves for marriage. So this is, in a sense, the most ultimate form of platonic relationship ever described on television. And yet, this show has been deemed by the cancel culture, the one that's been canceled by COVID, to be unacceptable, to be prejudicial and homophobic. I say phooey. One thing's for sure, South Park does neurolinguistic Parkergramming, that is to say programming by Trey Parker, especially if you see the show as a child. Now, they've clearly said the show is not for children, and I used to think that was sort of absurd because it's a cartoon, but I now agree. I say the show is for children to become adults. Hear me out. By the end of watching South Park, one has worked out all of their needs for profanity, even learning that the curses behind curse words are real spells that cause demons. And it is made clear that by the time that they are adults, most of them will conform to a more behaved mode, one with more civility than profanity. And the next thing I remember, it was 1999 and everything was a blur. The Spice Girls were gone and Marilyn Manson was in. The palace was a mess with strewn videotape and shattered AOL free premium CDs. Men, full-grown men, listened to Eminem and dyed their hair spotted with bleach hydrogen peroxide, like leopards. Like leopards. Truly, 1999 was the end of days, and came with it South Park the movie. Now, I remember watching South Park the movie at home from an online download because it was impossible to get a copy. I do also remember seeing part of the movie from a Skyview drive-in with a radio, standing there. But the day I saw South Park the movie, bigger, longer, and uncut, at home, was hilarious. Not just the movie, the day itself. Well, let me give you a quick rundown. So I had just finished downloading this file, which had taken about 3 days. And in the process, had finished watching Fight Club, The Matrix, and Saving Private Ryan. This would make me about 10 years old, similar age to the characters in South Park. And I went to the kitchen and walked by my mother, and spent the better part of the 70s in a rainforest, so I consider my mom to be quite a sheltered person already. When my mother tells me, my God, there's this terrible movie, and it's so important. So important, I ask my mother, and she says, yes, this movie is something that someday I think, I don't know if maybe when you're 21, then we'll watch it together. It's so important and so deep and dark, but it's causing soldiers to vomit just by seeing it. I ask her, what movie is this? And she says, Saving Private Ryan. To which I laugh. Saving Private Ryan? I just watched that. It wasn't even that good. Das Boot was way better. And I walk to the kitchen to get my chocolate milk and head upstairs. So this is also some perspective on the two different generations that are dealing with reality. Or well, at least one of them is. And then I started watching the South Park movie. South Park, bigger, longer, uncut. And it was Uncle Freakin-tastic. A movie actually about a movie. About two men making a movie that the four children love to watch and are forbid from seeing it by those who don't want to see it themselves. Eventually, by paying a homeless man to sneak them in, Kyle, Stan, Eric, and Kenny get to watch Terrence and Phillip, Asses of Fire, a foreign film from Canada, where all the smut in the world comes from, like Degrassi, and established immediately as a sort of interesting concept of racism, or rather an abstraction of it, where the Canadians are the inferior race, at least in the perspective of the enemy Americans, who look at the Canadians as a threat. But the kids love them. The kids just love them. And they spend the most of their free time hanging out, watching Terrence and Phillip, reading Terrence and Phillip comic books, and playing with Terrence and Phillip action figures. Terrence and Phillip is a pretty big deal. All the kids have them. It's pretty cool. Don't be lame, Mom and Dad. I know, they're Canadian. Don't be racist. You see, for Terrence and Phillip, farting is just part of their culture, harkening back to ancient British theater, however primitive. It's an existential musing which has been pontificated about for many millennia. Don't get me wrong, I like to stray away from fart humor, but if 8-year-olds aren't allowed to find this common ground when there are cartoons about them, what kind of sick Freudian game are we playing with the psychology of this entire generation? The fact is, accepting your flatulence is some sort of escape from flagellance. As absurd as it might seem, to accept yourself requires accepting and embracing in some ways even your faults. Later on, it becomes clear when members of South Park begin spontaneously combusting, simply from holding in their gases, that flatulence is essential. However, later it is revealed that the collective amount of unbridled flatulence is causing global warming and depletion of the ozone layer. And so the children are taught that there is a time and there is a place for everything, from flatulence to flagellance. Try to see how valuable of a lesson this really is. Through reason and consensus, however absurd, logic is concluded. Logic that has stayed with me since I first saw this episode 20 years ago. And I'm certainly not alone. In a way, so many are raised as the adults from this community that we grew up in together called South Park. And we're still growing. We're still growing in South Park all the time. Weirdly enough, because of South Park, we always remain young. Because, like a time machine, we can always go back in time to when we were younger and remember the good old days. And that collective consciousness permeates in everyone who's seen the show. And that's really the point of Terrence and Phillip, or TP. Terrence and Phillip represent the inner meta. Terrence and Phillip love you, and they'll always be there, and the ultimate export besides maple syrup that we all need. But the mothers of South Park decide they're against Terrence and Phillip, and they start to ban TP. Eventually it's not enough, so they end up kidnapping Terrence and Phillip in order to have them executed. And meanwhile, in hell, Satan and Saddam Hussein, who've recently started dating, hear the witch hunt going on upstairs. And Saddam Hussein, at least, if not Satan as well, see vindictiveness as an opportunity, where the unjustified evils committed by the mothers against Terrence and Phillip is found to be not at all godly, and in fact may be the very thing necessary to provide a key to open a door, to open the gates of hell. And Satan really just wants to see the world.
Up There, as sung by Satan in South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut.
Sometimes I think when I look up real high that there's such a big world up there. I'd like to give it a try, but then I sink, 'cause it's here I'm supposed to stay. But it gets so lonely down here. Tell me, why does it have to be that way? Up there, there is so much room where babies burp and flowers bloom. Everyone dreams, I can dream too. Up there, up where the skies are ocean blue, I could be safe and live without a care. Up there, they say I don't belong. I must stay below alone. Because of my beliefs, I'm supposed to stay where evil is prone. But what is evil anyway? Is there reason to the rhyme? Without evil there could be no good, so it must be good to be evil sometimes. Up there, there is so much room where babies burp and flowers bloom. Everyone dreams, I can dream too. Up there, up where the skies are ocean blue, I could be safe and live without a care. Live without a care. If only I could live up
But Saddam Hussein has more nefarious goals. For Saddam Hussein, he sees this opportunity to allow the hypocrites to create their own demise. By attacking and judging, they bring forth the precedent to be judged and attacked themselves, the result bringing forth Satan's reign, or Saddam Hussein's reign, because it seems like if Satan could make up with God, he would. And all of a sudden, we're not so far off from Dante's Inferno. In fact, it's like we're trapped somewhere in the middle. And maybe it was The Matrix or Saving Private Ryan or Buffy's philosophy, but all of a sudden the show seemed a lot deeper, a lot more profound than it had already been. Because now, South Park was on trial, arbitrating with God and the devil himself, pleading on behalf of humanity, arguing the value of all the things that we hold true and dear: choice, honesty, faith, destiny. I could feel Thomas Hobbes and John Calvin shaking in their graves, because the resolution of South Park is the resolution of liberty. And no longer was South Park about flatulence. It was about free speech, about free mind. It was about the choice that God had given us, that Lucifer had demanded. And it was about the war that we were having with not God and the devil, but ourselves and our own mothers, where everything became clear that if we were going to clean up the world, we were going to wade through knee-deep blood. And by, on the most fundamental level, trying to take away the choice of others, we are taking away the choice of ourselves. This is the ultimate paradox about civil liberty, about morality, and how we lose our own freedom. This is the lesson of starvation from Dante's Inferno, whereby our chains are tied too short to feed ourselves, but long enough to reach behind us and feed each starving prisoner with our backs turned. If we cut off ourselves and our children from part of existence, what can they become if not fractured? In isolation, how could we learn to resist temptation? This is the ultimate war on the mind. And fundamentally, the burning of books is just an excuse for history to repeat itself over and over. And at the end, despite the means, the children Kyle and Stan and Eric and the others stand there as human shields, ready to die, rather than to allow this war to continue, where innocents are murdered, and the parents, looking bewildered at what they had done and what they've become, observe the children's cry and spare the lives of Terrence and Phillip, and return the earth back to normal, with the help of the devil. And suddenly, the screenplays from South Park belonged in the libraries of Congress and Yale. It became evident that South Park had a capacity for eloquence. It showed beyond the Nostradamus predictions of The Simpsons, South Park could use the most extreme distorted positions in game theory in order to expose reality's most natural conclusion, within a range of probability. Trey Parker seems to have a wit and ear for the esoterics of revised history and hidden symbology, but it's so specific that you often have to question if it really is a piece of synchromysticism, at least by accident, instead of something planned. And to be honest, I'd say like with most of reality, it's about 50-50. You see, every episode of South Park is created in about a week. Because when they start a season, there are 10 episodes in 11 weeks with only 1 week break halfway through. Everything is rushed because they wanted to make sure that the censors didn't have enough time to review it. And this is a wonderful thing about the origin of South Park, because Trey Parker and Matt Stone were really interested in Monty Python, something really worth its own dissertation. But essentially, Monty Python was a show made by Oxfordian literature majors Or whatever, I think he went to Downing College in Cambridge. But actually, Terry Gilliam was from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Eric Idle went to Pembroke College in Cambridge. Michael Palin went to Brasenose College in Oxford. And Graham Arthur Chapman went to Emmanuel College in Cambridge. And St. Bartholomew's Hospital Medical College. And Terry Jones, Terry Graham Perry, who recently passed, went to St. Edmund's Hall in Oxford. All of them a bunch of geniuses. And they created a show which the producers demanded be named something with the word Python in it. So Monty Python it was. And to really understand the show, if you really ever wanted to, because it's not fully necessary, but there's an entire veil to be lifted when you do, it's important to understand that the way the show was made was a direct response to the events occurring locally at the time, like Shakespeare. So to really get Monty Python and what it's about, you have to find out when the show aired and what was going on that week, what was in the news and what was in the newspapers, how the media was presenting itself. Because Monty Python, very much like South Park, picked on the events of the world stage cleverly. And so, to the untrained eye, Monty Python, this synchromistic troupe of Oxford and Cambridge laureates, probably seems pretty stupid, especially their more early insular material, where you'd probably have to be a lord to really think it was that funny. I mean, how educated do you have to be to get Jabberwocky? I didn't get it the first time I watched it, I'll admit that. I mean, Holy Grail for sure, but Jabberwocky? And you can totally see the difference. Holy Grail appears to appeal to the common man. 'Tis flesh wounds instead of fart jokes, but Jabberwocky takes a defined autistic literary wit, and it belies the concept of Monty Python's troupe's laymancy. So the illustrated point here is that this is encoded media, and there are many forms of encoded media. And in order to understand encoded media, it would be good to try to understand at least one show. South Park is a great example. Monty Python is a great one, but I'll let someone else for now try to do some research into those newspapers, if you know what I mean. The reason why South Park is such a great example is because of the way it faces problems. Namely, they're far less absurdly dealt with than in shows like American Dad or Family Guy. And they tend to have a more altruistic than utilitarian resolve than, say, a Simpsons episode. South Park is focused around the fact that they're always in school, which gives the characters the abstract concept of growing up or going somewhere in life. Like, this is all moving towards something, and yet everything seems to helter-skelter back to 8 a.m. in front of the school bus. These lessons help the characters grow intellectually by accumulating certain sort of metaphysical goals and ideological talismans, while also teaching about the ways we deal with things in sorrow, in grief, in altered states, in vindictiveness, in vengeance. And at each moment, we could relate with one moment in our lives and another moment in one of theirs, but the character can always shift. This is the meta-personhood of South Park, where in The Simpsons, before many related with Bart and began to relate with Homer as they aged, South Park is a free-flowing metapsychological analysis of the human experience played out by spirit. At any one moment, I identify with any character, depending on what they're going through. And the characters themselves adapt themselves into each other, like some sort of Tavistock psychotheatrical therapy. And the characters that once seem inert all of a sudden become profound in ways that have not yet been described. For instance, Leopold STOTCH, otherwise known as Butters, from his namesake, Leopold, the first king of Belgium. An interesting character who brought forth an empire and whose son failed to defeat. Butters became very important after the death of another character named Pip, or Pippin. They say Pippin died because nobody liked Pip. How true that is. But it's not exactly the Pip from South Park. You see, Pippin is actually the son of Charlemagne, and Charlemagne's son Pippin led the great empire of Charlemagne to ruin, some would say. Though it might also be said by others it was stolen in the first place. Pippin lost control of the empire through his failed waited-out strategy of the Pippinids, his few but loyal followers, who held on to the idea of a lasting Charlemagne state. Of course, it did not last, and eventually it was mired in civil wars for centuries, and there would not be another leader like Charlemagne again until maybe Napoleon. And by the way, all of this is really interesting on the flamenco timeline, just gonna say, but if you look at the numbers between when Pippinid happens and Napoleon on the flamenco timeline, you might be interested. But this isn't really about that. So back to Napoleon, or Damien, as he's referred to, the one who kills Pippin. He is the son of the devil, and it seems to suggest that Pippin ends up rotting in hell when he's replaced again by Leopold. Leopold II of Belgium was king of Belgium from 1865 until 1909. And so it was the Belgian, Butters, who replaced Pippin when he was swallowed up by the fiery inferno of South Park. So am I wrong to say that there's a weird love triangle going on here and that Damien looks a hell of a lot, if you pardon the expression, like Napoleon? And so it was Butters, the king of Belgium, that replaced Pippin when he was swallowed up into the fiery infernos of hell. So one way or another, South Park is revealing all sorts of synchromysticisms, and it's definitely worth checking out.